Regional Council of Governments projection of how much traffic was going to be on the road, automobiles, and how many people are going to ride transit between now and 2025 if you don't build slow tracks. And this is their projection if you do build slow tracks. Did you see the difference? Let's see that again. That's if you don't build it, and that's if you do build it, and the difference was about 0.5%. And now that they're building fast tracks, well over half of the region's transportation budget is going for transit, and that transit today carries about 2%, about 1.7% of all travel in the region, of all passenger travel, no freight of course, and they're hoping they're going to get it up to 2.2% by spending over half your money on transit. The problem is that, you know, somebody once said $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon we're talking about real money. And now that isn't even true anymore. You have to talk about trillions to talk about real money. And yet people don't even know what $1 billion is. I had this slide showing how tall a stack of $4.7 billion bills would be if you piled them on top of each other. And it would be many miles higher than the International Space Station. Just an incredible amount of money, and of course it turns out 4.7 isn't enough. They say not only is it not enough to build slow tracks, once it's built they don't have enough money to operate it. Part of the problem that I noted during the campaign was that they were presuming that they were going to get a 6.3% increase in sales tax revenues forever, because over the past 20 years the average annual increase had been 6.3%. But you notice there were years in which the increase was negative, including the year right before the election and the year after the election. And they had presumed that they're going to have 6.63% forever. Well, I looked at their financial models and I found that if there was a recession any time between 2004 and 2017, they would not be able to build fast tracks. And they just said, oh, there's never going to be a recession. Never. No recession ever. Even though we're having one right now, there's never going to be a recession. And they just ignored that. And of course, now they're in big trouble. They're building one line that the federal government is funding, but they're saying they don't have enough money to fund the rest of the lines. We put out this little report called Web of Deceptions that lists 16 different lies about fast tracks. And that's really about all I want to say. You can download that report and see more lies if you're interested, but I want to look to the future. I'm more interested in winning tomorrow's battles than not refighting yesterday's battles. Sorry, John.
Yesterday's battle is coming back next year.
I know. But, you know, we have been called naysayers. You know, you're just against everything. You're against streetcars, you're against light rail, you're against high-speed rail. What are you for? So I sat down and started doing research on transportation for this book, and I discovered some things to be for. What I discovered is that America is on the verge of a new transportation revolution. And this transportation revolution is going to have as much of an impact on our day-to-day lives as the railroad, as the streetcar, as bicycles, as automobiles, as the interstate highway system. Probably a bigger impact than almost any of those. That transportation revolution is not going to be high-speed rail. It's not going to be light rail. It's not going to be any kind of collective transportation, because collective transportation is pretty much functionally obsolete in a society where we have 300 million people in 150 million homes and 100 million job places and 100 million other places to go. And you're just not going to get enough people together to ride trains or anything like that for them to make any sense at all. To really understand the next transportation revolution, I want you to think about the last few transportation revolutions. Think back to 1810. In 1810, almost nobody had ever traveled faster than a horse could run and lived to tell about it. In 1810, there were just beginning to be some experiments with steamboats. Other than the steamboat, the most recent transportation innovation was the stirrup. Okay? Over the next century, 1810 to 1910, we saw 5 major transportation revolutions. The steamboat, the canal, the steam railroad, the safety bicycle, and the electric streetcar. And other forms of streetcars, cable cars and horse cars. But the electric streetcar was really the critical one. It was cheap enough to run, and pretty soon 800 American cities had electric streetcars within 2 decades of their invention. And yet, by 1910, the majority of Americans were no more mobile than they had been in 1810. Why is that? Well, first of all, the steamboat and the canal and the steam train were mainly about freight. They weren't more about passenger travel. Yes, there were passenger trains. Yes, there were steamboats that carried passengers, but they were very expensive. And so only the wealthy used them. Very few middle class or working class people used them unless it was part of their job to travel. Second, the bicycle and the electric streetcar were used in cities, but a majority of Americans in 1910 still lived in rural areas. And even in cities, streetcars were only affordable for the middle class, that is, white-collar workers and their families. Blue-collar workers, factory workers, could not afford to ride streetcars, so they lived in high-density tenements, we later called them slums, next to their factories so they could walk to work because they couldn't afford the streetcar. So the vast majority of Americans were really no more mobile in 1910 than they had been in 1810. And then came the real breakthrough in personal mobility. It was the moving assembly line that Henry Ford used to make the Model T Ford. He started this moving assembly line in 1913, and he quickly cut the price of the Model T Ford in half, and he doubled worker pay. And for the first time, factory workers could afford to buy the things that they were making. They could buy the cars they were making, and they went out and they bought cars, and they discovered they could get better jobs because they could drive to a job that was better than the one that was within walking distance of their car. And employers discovered they had access to a higher quality workforce. And so personal incomes just started shooting up. They've increased 7 times since the development of the moving assembly line. And I estimate that half of that increase is due to the automobile. There are other factors that led to the other half, electricity and things like that, but the automobile caused half of that increase. Working class people could also buy houses. Instead of living in high-density tenements, they could go out to the urban fringe and buy a cheap lot and build a house on it. And so between 1930 and 1960, the percentage of people who owned their own homes increased by 50%. That was pretty much all working class people. In fact, there is very good evidence that all this stuff you hear about sprawl is middle class people who live in suburbs and who don't want working class people moving in next door. It's okay for us to live in the suburbs because we know how to appreciate it, but you should be penned in high density inner city neighborhoods. It's really upsetting to hear people sound so noble when they talk about sprawl and getting rid of it, when really it's a very selfish thing. Another great benefit of the automobile is that we now have access to all kinds of low-cost, high-quality consumer goods. In 1910, the average grocery store in America had 300 different products on its shelves. Today, the average grocery store has 30,000 products on its shelves, and you can find many that have 100,000 or more. And so people today, ordinary people today, have access to all kinds of consumer goods that wealthy people didn't have access to 100 years ago. And of course, we have better emergency services. We've got access to all kinds of social and recreation opportunities thanks to the automobile. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement owe their success to the automobile as much as anything else. And yet, despite all of these advantages, there are people who think we drive too much.